Upon its initial release in 1992, Reservoir Dogs was an instant, although unexpected, smash hit. It cost relatively very little to make, and of course it had a huge return. But it wasn't just a commercial success, it was also a massive critical success, and of course it springboarded the career of Quentin Tarantino. But despite all this success, there wasn't really much merchandising around this film until about 10 years later, when there was definitely a push for a 10th anniversary celebration and all the merchandising that you can think associated with it. It was also rather well timed for the release of the film on DVD. But crucially, a couple of toy lines also acquired the license to make some toys. Mezco produced a 6-inch scale of action figures, and I've done a video on those, so check that out. But also, Palisades produced a 1/6 scale line of figures. And interestingly, Palisades was a fairly short-lived company, sadly going into bankruptcy in 2006. But the quality of their 1/6 scale figures easily rivaled what Sideshow were producing. And so today I thought it'd be fun to dust down my own collection of Palisades Reservoir Dogs figures and take a closer look at them to see how they stand up all these years later. So I'll start off with Mr. Blonde. Now the first thing to note is that this is actually quite big, chunky packaging. This is noticeably bigger than, say, Sideshow releases, which were a lot thinner and narrower. They're probably twice the width of an average Sideshow collectibles figure. And the design of the packaging is quite nicely done. In the background we see that silhouette of the 4 figures walking towards the camera. It has got sort of a reddy sort of tint and tone to it. There's a small cutout window to reveal the figure and some of his accessories in the packaging there. And then we have this nicely painted image of the character itself on the right hand side of the packaging. So all in all, this looks pretty attractive. I think they've done a quite nice job of capturing the spirits of the film. If I was going to be critical though, I'd say it's probably quite busy. There's a lot of images here, a lot of different texts, which can be a little bit distracting and makes your eye look all over the place. But nevertheless, overall, I think this is pretty presentable. You can put this on display quite easily. If we look at the side panel, we can see that this is quite a substantial width, this is quite chunky packaging, and they've made good use of this side panel here. Again, we have that image of the characters walking towards the screen from that very famous side-scrolling title sequence, and we have the logo of the Reservoir Dogs there as well, which is very nicely done, and we also have an image at the bottom, and this film reel effect of the character, one is painted and one is taken directly from the film. I think this is a really nice touch, and when we put this next to other figures in the line, I think they look pretty presentable and they stack up nicely next to each other. The reverse of the packaging continues with the red theme, which looks pretty good. There's an awful lot of images and text here, which is a little bit distracting, just looks a little bit too busy for the eyes. But we have, again, that portrait of the main character in the top right hand corner. We have a little bit of information about the film, and then we have some images of the other figures in this series. So we can see Nash there, Mr. Brown, of course, Nice Guy Eddie. Meanwhile, at the very bottom of the packaging, we can see the announced Series 2 and the figures that would be in the next wave. And the front of the packaging also has this wonderful gatefold cover. So of course you can open this up. Again, on the left hand side we have some vital stats about the character. We can see different images of the character there in that film reel effect, which is nicely done. There's a bit of a bio, and there's also a nice individual quote from this character. In this case it's, "Are you gonna bark all day, little doggy, or are you gonna bite?" And then on the right hand side again we have that illustrated image at the bottom of the packaging, and of course that large window display showing the figure and all the various bits and pieces that he comes with. So all in all, I have to say I think this looks really good. There's less text, there's less graphics going on here. It makes it a bit easier on the eye, and I think this looks really, really nice. My first impression upon freeing these figures from the boxes is that you're holding something that feels like really nice quality. And it's very important to keep in mind the context that these figures were released in 2002. I remember opening these at the time and being blown away because this felt like a quantum leap forward in terms of what action figures could be. I still think after all these years that this head sculpt is very, very good. Now, with hindsight, I'm probably a bit more critical and think, well, in terms of the actual portrait of the actor, Michael Madsen, probably it looks a little bit too elongated, a little bit too aquiline. But I think they've managed to nail the hair, the forehead, the eyebrows, the features of the nose and the lips in particular. I think they've done a very, very nice job of that, getting that likeness pretty close. I particularly like that they've given that 5 o'clock shadow there, and I think the paint apps overall are very nicely applied here. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise to know that most of the figures in this line utilise the same body mould and the same costume repeatedly, and the tailoring for the most part is very nicely done. Certainly by today's standards, things like the breast pocket here look a little bit clumsy, but nevertheless the overall look and feel is very authentic to what we see on screen. It fits the body nicely. The material is a little bit thin, but that does allow for greater posability. But I'd say it's the shirt underneath that's probably more impressive. We have a very nice collar, we have this tie, and we have the buttons on the shirt, and also a functioning breast pocket. And to cap it off, we have this very nice belt as well, which is a separate piece. It's a faux leather, and there is a functioning metal buckle as well. Now, some of these figures, like Mr. Blonde, have a functioning holster as well, in which their weapon, in this case the Desert Eagle, can slide in very comfortably. However, the one thing I would say is that the jacket doesn't really close around this very well, so it does look a bit bulky and a bit unnatural if you decide to do this. Another nice touch is that if we pull up the trouser leg for Mr. Blonde, we can see that he actually has his cowboy boots underneath, which are quite nicely styled. They are one solid piece, but they look pretty good. And while we're looking at it, I may as well point out that all of these figures come with their own plastic Reservoir Dogs 10 years display stand. Mr. Blonde also comes with a watch. Now this is a plastic piece, it's not rubber, so you have to be careful when you're putting it on because there is a danger that it could snap off. But nevertheless, it is nicely sculpted and it's pretty finely painted as well, and this looks pretty decent. Okay, so looking at the articulation is of course the same for all of the figures in this line, so I'll just run through it at once. There is a ball joint in the lower neck where it joins the shoulders, which gives plenty of scope for mobility. So we can bend the head forwards, backwards, we can turn it to the side, it can also lean from side to side. There's a huge range of motion here which is pretty fantastic, and this is complemented by a swivel at the neck as well. There's ball joints in the shoulders so the arms can kick up and out. And there's a double jointed elbow, which means that the arm can bend right the way back and the hand can touch the head if you want it to. There's also a swivel in the forearm, which means you can rotate that lower wrist right the way around 360 degrees, and then there's a ball joint in the wrist itself, meaning of course that the hand can rotate 360 degrees and also hinge forwards and backwards. Now this ball joint might look a little incongruous when the sleeves are lifted up like this. They're having that big round joint doesn't look necessarily so fantastic, but when the sleeves are down, this is well hidden and it's not a problem. Now there is another ball joint in the upper chest region, which means you can bend the figure forwards, backwards, lean him from side to side, and of course turn from side to side as well in a swivel motion, which is absolutely fantastic. Then at the waist there is another swivel, so again he can swivel from side to side, and there's other ball joints in the hips, so the legs can kick out to the side there. There's also a complementary thigh swivel as well. The legs can kick all the way forwards and they can kick all the way backwards, and again supported by a double joint at the knee, so you can kick those legs right the way back if you want them to, which is absolutely fantastic. Now there is a swivel at the lower leg and there is a hinge at the ankle as well, although in these boots you're not going to get the most out of that articulation. Now all of these figures come with a whole host of extra goodies. There's a lot of common shared accessories amongst these figures, including cigarettes, lighters, cigarette packets, but there's also a lot of unique items. So for Mr. Blonde we have his shades, bottle of cola, masking tape, an oil can, and his Desert Eagle. The Desert Eagle is all one piece, but it is very nicely produced, it's very nicely painted. There's a sort of metallic silver paint which is nicely done, and the grip is painted black, but sadly there's no moving parts. Meanwhile, this oil can is very nicely produced, a lot of attention to detail here. Really like the various paint applications that we can see, the spilt oil all around this. It looks very dirty, very authentic, very lived in, and very worn. I think this looks fantastic. I think it's a little bit too big for what we actually see in the film. It's not quite screen accurate, but nevertheless, a very welcome touch. Now I did want to point out that the hands on all of these figures are exactly the same, and they're made of a very hard plastic, so it can be tricky to force your props into the hands. But with a little care and patience it can be done, and in the most times it does fit quite comfortably. The fingers usually do go onto the triggers and it looks pretty decent. But there are certain props, like the cola can for example, that's just too big. It will not go into his grip on either hand at all, like it's just too wide, and because there's no flexibility, because the hands aren't made of a nice rubber, it just simply will not accommodate this kind of prop. Sadly, the same is true of the masking tape. It's just too big and too chunky for him to hold this comfortably, so I generally have to hang it on the index finger, which pretty much does the job. And I think all in all, this looks pretty cool, and I think we've given enough accessories and enough room to play with here to create a diverse range of different looks to keep your display interesting and fun. Next up we have the Mr. Brown or Quentin Tarantino figure, and I think this must have been a first. I do think that Palisades got the jump on pretty much any 1/6 scale collection for producing the first Quentin Tarantino figure in this scale. And I have to say, I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job with this sculpt. I actually think of all the figures in this line, this is probably the best likeness. This is definitely Quentin Tarantino through and through. It just looks spot on to me. I love the attention to detail around the eyes in particular, the hair, everything about this just looks perfect. Now, virtually everything about this figure is pretty much the same as the Mr. Blonde, but one of the key differences is that obviously he's wearing brogues, so he doesn't have those boots, so these are nicely done once again, but he also has socks as well, which I thought was a really nice touch, and at that time I was blown away by this. I thought this was an incredible level of detail, which obviously nowadays we would definitely take for granted, but at the time this was pretty pioneering stuff for Palisades. Again, Mr. Brown comes loaded with accessories, including some of the old familiars such as a lighter, a packet of cigarettes, a lit cigarette, the Desert Eagle, but also he has some unique character pieces as well, including his snub-nosed revolver, the Like a Virgin CD and case, his shades, and an alternate head. And I've got to say, this is a pretty cool if very gory, unexpected extra to have here. It is basically the same mould, but of course it's all about the paint apps here. There is actually an indentation where the bullet has gone into the top of the forehead there, and of course we have that fantastic blood effect dripping down the front of the head, but also on the reverse we can see the blood continues to drip down, and we have that exit wound as well, which is pretty gory stuff. Here's an up-close look at that snub nose, very nicely sculpted, a lot of little bits of detail on this which I like, particularly on the grip, which of course is painted a different colour as well. Now unfortunately the hammer on mine is definitely snapped off, so that's something to be aware of. But I also want to point out that the Like a Virgin CD comes with a functioning opening case, which I think is brilliant, and the CD itself can be removed from that case and spun around. Wonderful stuff. I think this is absolutely brilliant. Again, there's lots of fun to be had with this figure, putting him in different poses and positions with some of these accessories. I really love the lighter and cigarettes. I think that works great. The actual cigarette, I have to say, doesn't really work for a lot of these characters because it's too small to be held in the grip, but it works very, very well for Mr. Brown because he's got that gap between his lips there and it just sticks in nicely, and it manages to hold itself in there very snugly, and it looks very good. Next up in Series 1, we have Officer Nash. Now obviously this figure represents something of a departure from the rest of the figures of this line so far because obviously he's in a very different outfit. And in terms of production values, I have to say I think this figure is probably the best of the entire line. If you look at the head sculpt, they've done a very good job here, and they've definitely spared no expense to really recreate that very tortured look that the poor officer has in the film. This is absolutely fantastic moulding and wonderful paint application here. He looks dirty, there's lots of blood and cuts, it's all applied very finely and accurately, and it looks pretty amazing all in all, I have to say. And they've definitely taken it to the next level in terms of authenticity when it comes to his missing ear, which is really bloody very gory to look at, but an incredible job. The tailoring on this figure is absolutely outstanding. It's a much thicker cotton material for a start. There's so many buttons and little details. We have his officer's badge at the top there, we have his name tag, and there's some of these fantastic pockets. Everything about this looks really good. We can see his vest underneath. It just looks really sharp, and it just, yeah, is definitely a cut above what we've seen so far. We can even see things like the American flag stenciled onto the arm there, which is very nicely done. And he has a fully operational buckle at the belt there, which looks really good, and you can slide on some of the extras so we can see, for example, his gun holster here. Although, interestingly, he's the one figure in the line who doesn't come with a gun, which is strange because he definitely has a space for one. But he's by no means a slouch when it comes to accessories because he does come with an absolute ton, including a clip holder, a torch, a walkie-talkie, a spare head, obviously undamaged, a radio, his ear, and a pair of functioning handcuffs. But that's not all, because he also comes with this chair as well, and this has been brilliantly painted. There's lots of little extra paint apps on here to show that the chair has been well worn. There's lots of scrapes and damages going around the frame of it, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic. And in terms of some of these extra pieces, they are actually functioning as well. So for example, his clip holder does fold open so you can see the clips inside. Sadly, you can't remove the clips, but nevertheless it's a nice little touch, and of course these slide onto his belt. Likewise, the torch holder unclips and we can see the torch in there, which is again nicely moulded, nicely painted, but sadly not removable. And then we have this very cool walkie-talkie, which actually is removable, which is pretty cool. And then we have the handcuffs, which are really cool because they're held together by a real chain, which is lovely. And then the plastic handcuffs themselves actually are functioning, so they unclip and you can put them around the hands of one of the figures and then clip them back into place. And then of course we can apply this to poor Officer Nash. We can tie him up behind that chair, and this looks really good. As you can see, this is pretty authentic and quite effective. And all in all, I have to say this is a really impressive figure. It looks really good. And when you put him next to Mr. Blonde, you have complementary figures here to really create a fantastic display that is ripped straight from the film itself. Now, a quick point to mention, I realised as I was making this video that I neglected to mention one of the key unique pieces from Mr. Blonde, and it's quite a significant one. It is, of course, his switchblade. This is a functioning piece that actually opens out, which is really very nice, and of course it is kind of integral if you're hoping to recreate a sequence like this. Now, the last figure in this first series was actually Nice Guy Eddie, and he was a Toy Fair exclusive, so he's a little bit more tricky to get hold of. And it's very difficult to judge a figure based on photos that you've seen online, but I have to say he's probably one of the less impressive ones in this line from what I can tell. It's great that he has a very different look and outfit to the rest of the figures in this line. That's always really good to make it more interesting visually when we put them on display. Sadly, he doesn't seem to have an awful lot when it comes to unique pieces in terms of accessories. He only really seems to have the mobile phone, which admittedly I do think is very, very cool and of its time. And the figure itself doesn't look quite right to me. I think tailoring looks fine in terms of the materials they've used, but there's something about the body that it doesn't look quite in proportion. That big rotund body versus the quite tall thin neck just looks a little bit incongruous to me, which is a shame, and I think ultimately the likeness doesn't look that sharp either. But as ever, please do take that with a pinch of salt because this isn't an in-hand review. Ultimately, I have to say I was really pleased to dust these down, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see just how well they've stood up over all these years, especially with all the advances that have been made in the last 20 years. This is pretty impressive stuff. A really fun collection, and I have to say a very high quality one for its day and age. So join me next week when I'll drop the second part of this video looking at the Series 2 figures. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.